POC solidarity is such a comforting concept in mind, and it's something that I think we all really want to see because we know that we are stronger in numbers and we're stronger united than we are when we're divided, but it's not something that really exists the way I think we want to believe it does. And without actually exploring why that's the case, we allow us to further hurt each other and only let white supremacy and colonialism continue to affect us and break us down. What's up, you guys? So I got the chance to watch the new movie Sinners by Coogler. Everyone's been talking about this film because it's one of those movies where it takes multiple watches and there is something that you discover every single time that you didn't notice the first time. But today I want to specifically talk about the Chinese characters in this film and what they represent, whether or not Grace deserves some grace or if she's to blame for all the chaos that ensued after she let the vampires in. I want to preface this video by saying that I always film in the day because I love the lighting much better than I do in the evening or at night, but I ran out of time today and I really want to get this out. But honestly, I think this works really well because, we're talking about a horror film and this is kind of giving that, so. And secondly, there are naturally going to be some spoilers as I give my character analysis, so if you haven't watched the film already, you should definitely go and see it before you come and watch this video. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. One thing that really fascinated me about the film Sinners is the use of representation, one that we have never really seen before, from the Choctaw characters in the beginning of the film to Remick not being our stereotypical racist white man, and then the Delta Chinese family that Smoke and Slack have a relationship with. And these are not just characters that Coogler threw into the story to help further the plot. They're actually based off of real life people and real life experiences. The Delta Chinese were a real group of Chinese immigrants that lived in the Deep South. They were an easy group of people to employ because they didn't have rights in the States and they were easily disposable. So they were the perfect demographic of people to bring from overseas to work on these cotton fields once slavery was done. But eventually a lot of the Delta Chinese ended up becoming merchants, owning and running convenience stores. And we still see this today where a lot of Chinese families own convenience stores in urban cities or in certain neighborhoods across the States and even here in Canada. Just like their Black peers, Chinese immigrants were heavily discriminated against and faced a lot of hardship once they were on American soil. I mean, they were not considered fully human, they were not treated right, and they were looked down upon. In an article by journalist Melissa Block, who actually went down to the South to interview these Chinese descendants of the first Chinese immigrants that came to the States, one of them had said, "We were in between, right in between the blacks and the whites. We're not black, we're not white." So that by itself gives you some isolation. They had a very unique experience because while they were not black, such as the majority of their peers, they were also not white. There's a documentary that I really wanted to watch, but that I couldn't get my hands on just yet, but I did read some articles about, and it's called Mississippi Triangle, which basically describes the relationship between Chinese immigrants, Black Americans, and white Americans who lived in the Deep South, uncovering what that dynamic was like. And these are people whose experiences have mostly been forgotten. I mean, how many times have you heard people talk about the Chinese immigrants who lived in the South? And when have you heard the stories of their relationships with their peers, such as their Black neighbors versus their white neighbors? So I thought this documentary was really interesting, and while I couldn't watch it, I did do some digging, and what I found was a really interesting point about the racism that started to exist amongst the Chinese community, even though they were oppressed just like their Black neighbors. The documentary follows Martha Lum, the child plaintiff in Gung Lum versus Rice, which is a case where the states decided in 1927 that Chinese immigrant children were not allowed to attend the same schools as white Americans. This came shortly after the Anti-Chinese Immigration Act in 1924, which banned all immigration from Asia. The children were expelled from the schools that they were attending, and they were told that they could either build their own Chinese school or join the African American schools nearby. It was a Jim Crow case that affirmed the exclusion of all non-white people, and not just Black people from white spaces, but its particulars are important too. And this is what Mississippi Triangle tries to show. It was not the case that Chinese Mississippians occupied the same social location as Black people, but as non-white people, they were subject to the whims of a white supremacist order. Theirs was an intermediate status. Chinese American commentators in the film described the injustice of Jim Crow and how they were ultimately beneficiaries of the civil rights movement. This part of the documentary becomes really interesting because we see how even though the Chinese immigrants were mistreated and oppressed, just like their black peers, and so while the Delta Chinese had more in common with African Americans, they still wanted to distance themselves from that community because they didn't want to be seen as low status the way African Americans, in order to align more closely with white people. An article that I was reading about this documentary actually highlights this through a teenager named Linda Wing, who explains that her parents didn't want her to get too close with black people and didn't want her to date black boys. And for her, that just made her feel more lonely because that is the community that she is most close with, because that's who the majority of her peers are. Her parents were also worried because she was assimilating herself so closely with the black community that her accent wasn't just Southern, it also had that Southern African American vernacular English slang. She's constantly been told as a teenager to separate herself from them, and that made things really difficult for her and drew the line of color between her and her black peers. And we see examples of this all the time, even today, where other communities of color will only want to be around black people when it benefits them, but they do not want to be too close to them. They do not want to actually accept the black neighbors around them. They don't want their children to be close to other black children. They don't want their families to be too immersed with other black families. Anti-black racism is something that has existed for generations upon generations. The same article highlights that the Chinese American commentators in the film describe the injustice of Jim Crow and how they were ultimately beneficiaries of the civil rights movement. When desegregation came, their fortunes changed in school and business, and yet they also describe being hesitant to get too close to black people. And we can see this explored in the movie Sinners. So now let's talk about Bo and Grace specifically and what they represent in this film. Bo is happy to see Smoke and Slack when they walk into his convenience store after years of not seeing them because they had moved to Chicago. The couple agreed to help them with their party by making a sign to help welcome the guests into the joint. Once the party starts, we can see Bo and Grace really enjoy themselves, immersed in the music that's being played by Sammy. Sammy's music not only speaks to his own people, but to other communities as well. His voice is a safe space for this dancer from another community to also dance and be liberated in her body and be liberated through music. And I thought this was also a perfect representation in the real world of how a lot of the work that black people have done ends up being beneficial not just to their communities, but other communities as well. Black art, black music, and black spaces have always given a spot to other communities of color to also have a seat at the table. But you don't really see the same offering when the roles are reversed. When things first start to go south, everyone's trying to figure out what are the next steps, what just happened, what do we do? But immediately, Grace's first instinct is to leave. And she literally says to Bo, "We came here to help them with the party, not this." And for me, this really represented something that we see a lot of with other communities of color, where we will be with black people and close to black people when we're beneficiaries of their culture or their work or their spaces, but as soon as they need us to have their back, we're out of there. Grace could have easily waited a few moments or had Bo check in and see what was going on, and they would have understood, or at least better understood, what the situation was, which then could have kept Bo from actually going out to get the car and maybe ultimately saving his life. But as soon as things got complicated, she was out of there because she didn't want to be involved and she didn't want to be associated. Now, once it's been clear that the crew is in some serious danger is when Grace's actions are now considered pretty controversial to people. Some people think that she has good reason to react the way that she did. Other people feel like she is kind of the antagonist because she's ultimately the reason why the crew didn't survive. When Grace finds out that Bo is a vampire and that Rimek has gotten so good into his head that there's a good chance that they will go down to the town and attack Lisa, their daughter, she loses it completely. At that point, she doesn't care to stay safely inside the juke joint until they have a plan. Her only goal is to kill Bo to protect Lisa. And I have to defend Grace here because she is ultimately a mother, and that's something that I think we all have to remember. A mother's instincts and a mother's protectiveness is unlike any others. A mother will put themselves in danger in order to protect her child, and I don't think any mom out there would disagree that it doesn't matter who is in the way or what happens. All that matters to you is protecting your child. So of course, in calling in the vampire, she was putting not just her life, but everyone else's life at risk. That's a risk that Grace is willing to take because she's a mother. And all that matters to her is that she's able to protect her baby. And honestly, she goes out like a G. I mean, she goes straight to Bo, caught on fire, burns to death, but ensures that he is killed in order to keep Lisa safe. But that being said, I do still think that if Grace took a minute to just think and to allow someone like Annie, who had as much knowledge as she did have, to tell her what they should do next, they would have actually probably had a better plan going into the attack, maybe even had a better chance at survival. She wasn't even thinking and just called in the vampires without the crew actually being ready to take them on. And for me, that also represents how in moments where we need to listen to Black voices to understand their struggle or what steps to take to actually have equality in society, those voices go unheard or spoken over, because like I said, Annie had knowledge that Grace did not have. She knew exactly what they needed to do in order to defeat the vampires. Grace, for me, is definitely a character that represents POC solidarity and how it can be something that can actually really unite us and make us stronger as marginalized groups of people, but that is really and truly a fantasy almost, because it doesn't quite exist when we really need it to, especially when it comes to protecting Black people in particular. Before I end off this video, I want to highlight exactly how Coogler chose to represent the Asian American characters in this film, because it feeds a lot of the stereotypes that have been perpetuated against Asian Americans. Bo is a masculine, headstrong, handsome husband and father, as well as a business owner. Three things that racist depictions of Asian people have been refusing to showcase for honestly generations. I mean, we have seen in the past Asian men represented as docile, socially awkward, strangely incapable of being a satisfying partner in the bedroom, and undesirable. But in this film, Bo demands attention. Bo dances with his wife sensually on the floor, and throughout the night we can see how he is a business partner to Slack and Smoke. White supremacists during the time of Jim Crow, and even now to this day, were so afraid of Asian men being seen as masculine and capable because they were afraid of white women falling in love with them, and they were afraid of this procreation of half white, half Asian children. They were also afraid of Asian Americans taking their positions of power. And what they were most afraid of was the African American and the Asian American communities banding together to stand against this racist society that only gave privilege to white people. They were so afraid of these communities banding together that they ended up pitting them against one another. It convinced Asian Americans and a lot of other POC groups that they were better than their African American peers, which is why they were doing better in society. African Americans were in a very different kind of danger when it came to racism. I mean, Asian American businesses could flourish, but African American businesses were more likely to be attacked by the Ku Klux Klan and to be demolished by racist mobs, and giving other communities of color a little bit more leverage, convincing them that it was something in their character and their work ethic that made them more successful, rather than these clever, systematic choices that were being made to keep these two communities separated. And not just separated, but working against one another. What I also thought was interesting is how they presented Grace, because the stereotypical racist depiction of Asian women is that they are docile, that they are more like pets to white men who fetishize them, whereas in this film, we see Grace as a headstrong, no-nonsense woman who also takes care of business alongside her husband, and even goes as far as negotiating a deal with Smoke when they first come into their shop. And in this way, the representation of Asian Americans in this film is so well done, honest, and authentic compared to the representation that we have seen of these communities from white filmmakers and white creators. Anyways, those were all my thoughts on the Asian American representation in this film and my thoughts on Grace's character and her actions in the film. Let me know what you guys thought in the comments down below. I'm really curious. A lot of people have a lot of opinions about Grace's character and also have a lot of insight on the representation of the Chinese characters in this film. So let me know what you think, and if you have not subscribed already, what is you doing, bruv? Get to it, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.